Hello everyone, and welcome to another unscripted video. I'm going to be doing this one a little bit differently to my previous ones, so the visuals will be a bit different, and I am doing it a bit more unscripted, and I'm just going to hopefully cut out bits where I ramble too much, and we'll see how that goes. In this video, I wanted to talk through some of the design process that went into the combat system, some of the iterations that I went through, hopefully some of the lessons that you can learn if you are thinking of doing your own TTRPG combat system. So one of the things I started with when thinking about my combat system is I had a number of goals that I wanted the combat system to achieve. When I was originally starting, I don't think it was this formally considered, but I definitely had some key elements that I wanted the combat system to have. Many of these design elements, I'll be honest, came more from things I didn't want the system to do rather than things I wanted the system to do. I had criticisms of the way other RPGs had handled combat, and I wanted to try something new. So I think one of the first goals for my system was I wanted the quality of the attack roll to matter. Essentially, I wanted how well your attack roll rolled to be more impactful than a binary success-fail. It's a thing that I know has been discussed in some of the other RPGs that are in development at the moment. Mainly I'm thinking about MCDM's Draw Steel, and I'm thinking about the DC-20 system by the Dungeon Coach, both of whom have taken sort of the opposite response to this issue. And just to sort of be really clear about what the issue is, in D&D, when you make an attack roll and say you beat their armor class, that feels really good, and then you go to roll your damage and maybe you roll really low, and that doesn't feel so good. Similarly, there's the problem of missing in D&D as a null state. MCDM talks about that a lot, and that's why they removed the attack roll. That was a goal for me. I wanted the attack roll to matter. Goal number 2, I wanted the defender to have interesting choices, and that's not just choices like in the moment, in the throes of combat, but also I wanted building a defensive character to be a fun puzzle to solve where there were more than one correct answer, essentially. D&D has a big problem, I think, with the way defensive characters work, where you're more or less doing the same thing every single time. And by the action side of things, I mean, I want the defender to have some agency. Goal number 3 is that I want to keep the number of dice rolls to a minimum. This is sort of carrying on a little bit from point number 1, but obviously D&D classically has 2 damage rolls. There's either the attack roll or the saving throw, and then there is a damage roll. If I was going to add more complexity to the attack roll, I wanted to remove complexity in other places maybe. At the very least I wanted 2 dice rolls as a maximum. My 4th kind of goal was I wanted there to be a parity in the way magic attacks work and the way weapon attacks worked. Essentially I wanted them to be using the same basic framework. Not only does that make learning the game easier, because then there's just one system you need to learn and can apply it to everything, it also meant that there was inherently going to be some balance to spellcasters and marshals, which was a goal for my game. The Verve setting is inherently sort of lower magic, so I didn't want magic characters to be that much more powerful than everyone else. Lower magic in a power sense. Magic is pervasive, but it's not as powerful. On that sort of magic martial parity, I also wanted it to be possible to focus on your mental ability scores and be good as a martial character, and focus on your physical ability scores and be good as a spellcaster, or at least viable. So that was sort of a built-in goal to parity. And I think the final goal, and this is just a fundamental thing to remind yourself of whenever you're doing TTRPG design or game design of any kind, is it should be fun. I wanted the system to be enjoyable and fun and tactically interesting and as quick as possible. And I think all of that are sort of your fundamental goals when building really anything for a TTRPG. So with those goals in mind, I arrived on this concept of exceedance fairly quickly. I should say, if you haven't already, go watch my combat video, because I'm going to discuss the concepts in that video I arrived at this fairly quickly because I'd already established this idea for standard ability checks, where the amount you exceed the difficulty class is how well you do, by simply saying that the difficulty class for the attack roll is a defense roll. I'm already at a reasonable system there. This also meant maximum, like worst case scenario, you're rolling 2 dice rolls, the attacker rolls 1 and the defender rolls another. Based on that, and sort of thinking about the way the skill system worked, I came up with the idea of the attack styles, and this very naturally let me use that goal of having the mental ability scores be useful in combat. I liked the idea of a very strong-willed character wielding a big heavy weapon, using their muscles sure to make the swing, but putting a bit of their force of personality, their drive behind that swing, and that led to the swing style, which is 2 strength and 1 spirit. And similarly, I really liked the idea of a very crafty, dexterous character using like a rapier or a spear or something to pierce past an opponent's defenses and stab them in the side or something, using their intelligence to find the right spot to strike. That sort of led me to this spectrum of attack rolls of pierce, thrust, chop, and swing, and similarly the same sort of spectrum of rolls in spellcraft and in ranged attacks. Based on those attack styles, it also meant that having my different weapon types interact with those styles in very natural ways, you inherently make the choice of what weapon you use quite interesting. And the only way for attack styles to matter is if there is an equivalent defense style, and naturally it made sense to have one defense style for each ability score, so there is dodging with your dexterity, blocking with your strength, demodulating with your intelligence, and neutralizing with your spirit. And by making different attack styles target different defenses, you're inherently at this point where there's not always one best option for how you should attack. With that, I've basically met all of my goals. At least I felt I had met my goals. Obviously I needed to do a lot of playtesting, but playtesting proved that this initial design was fairly robust. There was some tweaking around the way passive defenses worked. I wanted to be in a scenario where if the attack roll initially was not very good, then you don't need to roll the other dice. You can just say, oh, it's lower than my passive, let's move on. And that just speeds up the game a little bit. One of the really nice things that came out of this combat system, where you had these different attack styles that target different defenses, is it led to a natural arc to your average combat. When the combat starts, you're initially trying to sort of probe your target's defenses. Are they weaker in strength or dexterity? And then you would move on to trying to debuff or control the attackers, and then in sort of the final phase of the attack, based on those knowledge and those debuffs, you can apply effort to some attacks to deal wounds, to deal lots of damage, and finish them off. Not every combat worked like that, and this wasn't a thing that happened when players were just learning the system, but later on I think there definitely was some development in that area, which was interesting. And yeah, playtesting was really valuable, not just for ironing out the kinks in the system, but also learning how to teach the system to new players, which is actually a surprisingly big part of game design. Is, it doesn't matter how good your game design is if you haven't communicated it to your players and they know what they're doing. So that brings me on to the initiative system, and the initiative system was considerably less smooth sailing to design. It went through quite a few iterations and one massive false start before I landed on the current design. But similarly, I had a bunch of goals for my initiative system. I think maybe 1 or 2 of these were a little bit misplaced, but I didn't know that when I started. So my first goal for the initiative system was that I wanted there to be a more realistic and understandable timeline of events. One thing that I always find confusing about standard D20 fantasy combat systems is the 6-second time frame doesn't really make sense, especially when you're having turn-based combat where 6 seconds follows another person's 6 seconds that happened at the same time. When you think about how much that can happen in those 6 seconds, especially if there are spellcasters involved, once you've completed a full round of combat, it's very difficult to figure out how those events happened simultaneously. It just doesn't work like that. trying to think about your turns as happening simultaneously is like a fundamental issue with turn-based combat, but I wanted to at least improve that somewhat so that there wasn't this sort of dissonance in the way the mechanics played out and the way the story was supposed to play out. Secondly, I wanted movement speed and movement in general to be much more realistic. I know I did a whole video about movement speed because it's something I, for some reason, care a lot about. I don't think it's that important, but it was a problem I wanted to solve. D&D has the dash action, which basically means you can move twice your normal speed, and for your average character that means running 60 feet in a round, which is equivalent to running 100 meters in 33 seconds. That is not particularly fast, especially for something called dash. So yeah, I wanted to fix that. I also wanted movement speed to be based on your dexterity score. I think that just makes so much more sense. Dexterity is supposed to be your agility, your speed, so it should impact movement speed. Another goal I wanted for the combat system is I wanted it to be theoretically possible to do combo attacks, mainly because they're such a cool narrative moment. They're quite popular in media, in fantasy media. You see two people attacking simultaneously to strike a target. It's very cinematic and it's very cool. And I wanted a way for that to play out in-game. Goal number 4, this sort of ties into my idea of having a more realistic timeline. I wanted it to be possible for actions to essentially have a duration to them, like take longer to carry out. A bit like how in Pathfinder some actions require multiple action points. That's kind of the idea. They're saying like, yeah, this casting this spell is a more advanced action, so it's going to take more of your time to do so. I wanted this mainly for spellcasting as another balance opportunity. Inherently, magic has this advantage over melee combat in that you are safer, and I wanted there to be a sort of risk and reward to going into melee. And one of those ways that makes sense for the magic system and for the combat system is if spellcasting takes a little longer. My next goal was based around actually starting combat. I wanted the start of combat to be as quick as possible. Again, thinking about D&D or Pathfinder or similar systems, there is the initiative roll, and the problem with the initiative roll is that it's this moment that breaks the narrative flow of the combat encounter, often for multiple minutes, as everyone rolls dice and you have to compare everyone's number against everyone else's number. If the GM has multiple different units that they're having to roll separately for, that takes a while, and by the time it's all said and done, that moment has been lost, and any sort of narrative drive that was pushing the scene forward has probably faded. I really wanted the narrative to flow much more quickly from people taking offensive action to being in a combat scene. And then again, as with the basics of the combat system, I wanted it to be fun. That was a sort of fundamental goal, just to remind myself of, make it fun. I sort of collapsed all of these ideas, these goals, into what I began naming the system. I was calling the combat system Flow, and that's basically, despite Flow referring to different things throughout the development process, that name stuck, because I like it, and I think it also ties into some of the themes of the Verve as a setting as well. Flow started off as a system based around what were essentially cooldowns. Each action had a certain number of rounds before it would complete, the idea being that a round would go very quickly, because if everyone sort of have these cooldowns running, it doesn't matter that you're going to do something in 5 rounds because someone else is doing something in 6 rounds and someone else is doing something in 3 rounds. So actually it's going to be very quick before that action came up. At this time, because of that thinking, I made each round represent half a second, which, thinking back on, was just why? Why half a second? It just doesn't feel intuitive. But anyway, and each action had what I called an STA value, which stood for steps till action. I was calling the round steps. Again, I don't know why, but this was the original design. At the start of combat, when you rolled initiative, it was a thing that each person could do personally, so you weren't having to get everyone to talk about what different numbers they got. You personally would roll your initiative dice, which I think was 2 dexterity, 1 intelligence, or maybe 2 and 1 dexterity. And based on the result that you got, it would correlate to an initial STA, initial delay before you can do anything. So if you rolled really well, you might be only at an STA of like 1, so you're basically going to act immediately. And this basically models your reaction time, right? One of the goals at the time was I wanted to truly lean into this simultaneous reality of combat. Everyone's doing things simultaneously. And for that reason, I had this mantra, this sort of rule that was in place, that goes as follows. The consequences of actions in a particular round are only felt at the start of the next one, which essentially means if you attack a target and deal some damage, they do not take that damage until everything in that round is completed and we've started the next round. In this way, all of the consequences are simultaneous. And this meant that it didn't matter in what order you resolved actions. You could just go round the table, or you could just do it randomly, or whatever, because the consequences would be the same regardless. This was a bad idea. It made things very confusing, in particular with regards to movement. So if I outline a very simple scenario, say there are 2 melee combatants. They're right next to each other, but one of them is low on health, and so uses their action to turn and flee, right? They run away. Then the other combatant takes their action to attack them, right? They make an attack roll and deal some damage. And the player who ran away is confused because, hang on, I ran away, you can't hit me. But of course, the consequences of actions are only felt at the start of the next one, which means that until the round completes, that person is still where they started out. And this was just a nightmare to keep track of, because especially in regards to the way cover works, and area of effects, and all of these different things just were so confusing, because you had to remember where you were. This is the kind of thing that if you were making the game digitally, like if this was a video game, you could maybe make this work, but not on a tabletop. It just doesn't work. Regardless, it was a system I really wanted to work, and so I kept trying. I thought maybe it was an education problem. Maybe if I teach my players how it works a bit better, they'll understand it and it will work. But this never worked. I know there is a game called Grandia, I think. I've never played it, but I've heard about it from sort of game design videos, which is sort of exactly what this system was, right? Your actions have cooldowns, you have to wait until the action completes, and there's a little timeline effect. As I say, the system didn't work. It was way too clunky, and it wasn't fun, fundamentally. There was just so much waiting around that even when a round did go quickly, it didn't feel good to do nothing. I thought that I could fix it by separating out movement from the system, because yes, moving was a whole separate action, so you couldn't move an attack in any way. You'd have to spend a number of rounds moving, and then initiate an attack action, and then you would stand there for 5 rounds, and then you would make your attack. I tried to fix that by saying, okay, what about if every round you can do a little bit of movement? But this just made things worse, because now everyone was doing something every round, but you weren't doing your interesting thing of attacking. This is when I had a bit of a brainwave, and the idea is sort of an adaptation of a concept from the RPG Bravely Default, or Bravely Default, however you want to say it. I don't know how many people have played this game. I played it a good while ago, and it is such a good game. Really good story, really good combat system, really good class mechanics. It was just really fun. And the combat system in Bravely Default is really clever. The way it works is you have your 4 characters, because it's a JRPG, so of course you have 4 characters. And on their turn they can choose to go default, which essentially means they do nothing except kind of defend themselves a little bit, and they can save up their action points from that round and save them to next round. And you can do this up to 4 times, I think. And then once you've saved up your action points, you can go brave and do multiple actions all at once. And there were some special actions that maybe cost 2 action points or 3 action points. The thing I realized is that there is a parallel between an action having a cooldown, taking a certain amount of time. That is the same thing as having to wait, having to default maybe, and then do an action, right? Those are analogous. They're sort of 2 sides of the same coin. But by reframing your doing nothing turns as gaining in resources, you're gaining in action points, it totally changes the feel of the system. Rather than, oh, I have to wait until I can do something interesting, my thing's counting down. It is instead, ooh, I can't do my action, but I can gain all of these resources so I can do cool things later. Regardless of what you're doing on your turn, you're always gaining something, either gaining damage against your opponents or gaining in action resources. And this worked so much better, so much better. When I made this change, I renamed these action points to flow points, and essentially action points came to represent how ready you are, how prepared you are, which also has a nice narrative to it. And with the flow system, I could get the effect I wanted of magic actions taking longer than martial actions by essentially just making them cost more flow, right? If casting a spell costs you more flow than attacking, just by the natural back and forth of your flow value, you will be attacking more often than you will be casting a spell, right? You're attacking with a weapon. And yeah, this system worked so much better. Firstly, because it let me keep a one action per player per round system, so you were always doing something, you always had your one action, but that meant, because it was just one action, each round was still going by relatively quickly, and particularly quickly if people were doing some of the more simple actions. It also allowed me to make movement much more intuitive, and because the time steps were larger, I could make movement use your dexterity and be really impactful. Flow values allowed me to ditch this awkward consequences of actions are only felt at the start of the next round shtick, which didn't work, and just say that the order of event is determined by your flow value, which both ties into the narrative of flow being preparedness. If you're more prepared, you go first, makes sense, but also led to some really cool tactical options where maybe you want to wait to increase your flow so that you can go first next round, that kind of thing. It also meant that there wasn't this weird delay before you did your action, so there was a problem with the old system where you could initiate, say, a ranged attack, you're drawing your bow back, focusing on the target, but because it takes so many rounds for you to actually loose the arrow, that player could spend that time going to cover, and then you're there ready to launch an attack, but your target is out of sight. So what do? Now it's just, you do your action and it resolves immediately, so there's none of that awkwardness. And yeah, as I said before, because you're always doing something meaningful with your turn, it just felt so much better. And this was immediately reported with my players' feedback. They were like, yeah, this is so much better. I feel useful all the time, which was great. There still was some tweaking to do. So initially the way that it worked was there were 6 actions: the wait, the move, the dash, the interact, the melee attack, and the ranged attack. And originally the wait action was the only thing that gained you flow, but I realized very quickly that this disincentivized movement too much, and if I was going to aim for a combat system where things feel very fluid, I needed people to be encouraged to move. And so I shifted the balance of what gained you flow and what lost you flow, and found that the sweet spot was when, for every action that decreased flow, there was another action that increased flow. And that basically meant that every other round you were probably making an attack or interacting, doing something impactful. Constructing the combat system in this way, it allowed me to reach another goal that I've had for the whole TTRPG system, which is I wanted all of your ability scores to matter. Obviously I'd already achieved some of that by making a defense roll for each of your 4 ability scores, so there's inherent value in making sure you're strong in all of your ability scores. But with the way stamina and morale are calculated, I'd given a boost to how valuable strength and spirit were, by them being worth double for calculating stamina and spirit. Dexterity had been used to calculate your speed, which depending on the combat could be quite valuable, and also valuable outside of combat. Obviously speed is a useful thing to have. And I was really hoping to find a way to make intelligence matter. Flow being this measure of your preparedness, it made total sense that your intelligence would come into play by how quickly you can gain flow, how quick thinking you are. The perfect way to do that was the amount of flow that you gain both at the start of a combat encounter and when using the wait action. If I made it 2 plus your intelligence score, that meant that on average it was a +5, which perfectly balanced out the flow table, but it also meant that increasing your intelligence had this inherent advantage because it meant you're going to be more able to do your actions quickly. By having this static value that you start at the beginning of a combat encounter, unless you're surprised, in which case it starts at 0, it meant that there was basically 0 delay at all from entering a combat scene. The guards draw their swords, we're in combat, what are you doing? Right, because the player immediately knows, oh, we're in combat, well, I have a flow of 6, okay, because I have intelligence 4, bang, I'm in. Okay, I'm going to dash forward, I'm going to cast a spell, I'm going to do whatever, which is exactly what I'd been aiming for. Now, one part of a combat system that's an important thing to think about, especially for turn-based combat systems, is this idea of action economy. Action economy basically says that one of the resources that you have as a fighter, it's not just like your hit points or your stamina or your spell slots as a spellcaster, but it's also the actions that you have available to you. And this leads to a slightly unfortunate scenario where a single big bad is often less threatening than a large group of minions, because they can only do one thing, right? They're only one creature. Whereas all of those minions, well, they can make so many more attacks, or they can spread out and grapple, or they can do all these other things. Unless they're all clustered together and you can do a big explosion and kill all the minions, they are going to be the more threatening fight, which is not the way you want your game to flow narratively. Now, obviously, there is a certain amount in which being outnumbered should be a disadvantage, right? My very limited experience from doing LARP is that if you're in a 2v1 fight, the two players have a distinct advantage, like no question about it. But I did want the ability to lessen that advantage in the game for those big narrative important monsters. Now, D&D has solved this by adding in legendary actions and lair actions, and in the 2024 rule update, it sounds like they're going for bosses having multiple reactions. But as my system is inherently built upon this one action per player per round idea, and I didn't want to compromise that, I needed another way of solving this same problem, because it was going to be a problem. But luckily, the flow system gave me a really easy solution to this problem, which is your big bads can just gain flow faster, right? So at low levels, a boss might just gain 1 flow every single round, essentially making their wait action like 3 plus intelligence, their move a +5, etc. And this just means that they are going to be attacking more often than a regular monster. And from playtesting, this worked really well. When I did the boss fight, it was against a big ooze monster. The ooze was so much more maneuverable and frightening because it was just able to attack that little bit more quickly. But yeah, that's the process that got me to the combat system as it is today. No doubt I will develop it further in the next months, years, and I will look back on the decisions I've made now and think that they were as foolish as my first draft of the flow combat system. But I think it really speaks to the importance of playtesting and being ready to change your design. I stuck to the flawed flow system for way too long, and it led to some not so fun games with my friends, which would have been better to be more adaptable and change quicker and really follow what's fun. While my players did have some useful advice for how they would want to change the system, it was often more useful to listen to what they didn't find enjoyable, less their suggestions, because they 100% know what is not fun. They don't necessarily know the right way to take the game. They're just as flawed as you are as a designer. They might have good ideas, sure, but that's not necessarily going to be the silver bullet. You know for certain that what they say is not fun is something to look into changing. I also think it's valuable to have some goals in mind, just to keep you focused on your design and what you're aiming for, because it led to the type of game that I wanted to develop. Those are the key takeaways. Obviously, I am very proud of where the combat system is today. I do think it is really good. I think it has some really unique ideas that I haven't seen in other systems. Hopefully you guys found that interesting, and if you have any thoughts, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in my next video.